correct antibiotic. Should we open with a prayer? Okay, sounds good. Well, good evening. Thank you all so much for being here. Welcome back to the Great Book series at the Fishinger Road Church of Christ. So far this year, we have talked about Les Mis and Pride and Prejudice. Tonight, we are discussing Don Quixote. And then coming up, we'll be looking at Dracula and the Lord of the Rings. And one more? To Kill a Mockingbird. So that's what we've done, and that's what we've got coming up. Let's begin with a prayer, and then we'll talk about Don Quixote. Father God, thank you so much for today and for all the blessings that you give to us. We're thankful for opportunities like this where we can come together as a church and just talk about various things, especially this series where we get to talk about books together, where we can bond over some of the things that we have in common and the shared interests that we have, and especially as we examine your Christian worldview and what you've outlined for us in Scripture, and how that compares to some of the major works of writing of humans over the last few hundred years. I pray that our conversation tonight is fun and edifying for those in this room, and we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So tonight we're talking about Don Quixote, and I took several years of Spanish in grade school. My senior year of high school, we had so I'll preface this. Greg has been saying I've translated Don Quixote from Spanish to English. That's 1,000 pages of 400-year-old Spanish. So that's very, very difficult. I read and sort of translated a student abridged version of part 1 of Don Quixote my senior year. So not quite the same thing, but I have seen the whole piece in its Spanish. I've read through various sections in Spanish and read through the whole work in preparation for tonight. It's a great book and really pivotal in just modern literature in many different ways. Don Quixote is considered by many to be the first modern novel. It was written in 1605, part 1, and then part 2 was written in 1615. So that was about 400 years ago. And at the time, the most popular version of writing was really plays, was what was taking off. This is around the time of Shakespeare. And so the author, Miguel de Cervantes, is a sort of contemporary to Shakespeare. We'll get into that in just a moment. But instead of plays, Don Quixote is in full a novel. Part 1 reads very episodically. There's lots of little stories back to back to back to back, but it still has kind of a rising action, a climax, and a falling action, exposition and resolution. So it carries this framework of a novel and is really the first of its kind in modern European history. There were many books before the Don Quixote was written, but they didn't have the same kind of storytelling traits and the same things that we look at today and call it a novel or call it a piece of literature. Things like character development, plots and expositions and climaxes and falling actions. What you would see before this was really stories that were written sometimes very well, that had a few of those qualities, but other times were pretty flat. It inspired a lot of different things, and especially archetypes. We'll get into that in just a moment, but there are a lot of things that Don Quixote does for the first time that we see today mirrored in tons and tons and tons of books and stories. It became a really pivotal, almost foundational work for novels that we have today. It is originally written in Spanish, and it's the most translated novel in history. I think the most translated work of fiction. And that's very cool. It's in many, many different languages. That also means that as you pick up an English copy, there are many different English translations of it. Some dating back to about 300 to 350 years old. It was around the first time it was translated into English. And then people are still translating it into English today and updating it. And so we can kind of compare it to the Bible in that sense, that there are multiple English translations, and you'll get a different type of translation from one person than you will from another. And so if you've ever picked up Don Quixote and you're reading through it and you did not like it, maybe try a different English translation. My pitch for you tonight, I think this discussion should be fun for everyone who's read the book, but I'm assuming there's a good group in this room who've not read the book. And my pitch to you is that it would be very fun to read. It is a good time, and especially if you find a decent translation that's decently modern. I'd say within the last 50 to 100 years, decently modern. It will be in readable English, and it's a real good time. The author, Miguel de Cervantes, is an interesting guy. He's kind of a contemporary of Shakespeare. I say kind of because he was not really known for his works in writing until he was 57 years old, is when he published Don Quixote. Before that, he was a playwright, so he was trying to be kind of like Shakespeare, and failed miserably. Not a single one of his plays ever made it to stage. He made zero money off of it. So he was not a famous author. He was not really known as a writer. And so you couldn't really call him a contemporary until Don Quixote was published. That was towards the end of his life, and it really immediately blasted him into the realm of fame. What's interesting is, compared to Shakespeare, we know almost nothing about Shakespeare and his personal life, to the point where people argue that Shakespeare didn't exist or he was not a real person. We have such little evidence of his day-to-day life and his backstory that even his existence is up for argument. Miguel de Cervantes, on the other hand, we know a whole lot about his life. And he had a really interesting life. There's a little outside of the scope of tonight, but he was in a few different wars. At the age of 24, he was badly injured in war and lost the use of his left hand entirely. And so as he was writing this, he did it all one-handed, which for 1,000 pages is pretty. We all write one-handed anyway, but I don't know how well his left hand worked to hold the page while he was writing. But just really interesting. He ended up going to prison, probably for something he didn't do when he was a tax collector, was a job that he had. And then he was held captive on pirate ships for some years. Really just a wild personal life leading into this. He arguably has a self-insert in Don Quixote towards the end of chapter 1. There's kind of a random character. They all feel random when they pop into the book. But there's a guy who has a very similar background and history to Miguel de Cervantes, who pops into the story. Doesn't do a ton. But Miguel de Cervantes died in 1616, 1 year after publishing the second part of Don Quixote. And the first part, like I said, was very popular almost immediately. So he was very well known. He became very famous. And so for 10 years, maybe 11-ish years, he got to really enjoy that. But he took pretty bad publishing deals on these books. And so he made very little money despite the massive success. And so he was very famous, but he didn't have, that fame for much of his life. He didn't have a lot of wealth or esteem that he really got to see during his lifetime. And so for how important this book has become and how much we are still talking about it and still publishing it and still putting it out into the world, a little, I think, Pablo Picasso-esque, where he didn't really get to see a ton of that in his lifetime. As usual, I get excited and I talk pretty quickly about all of this. If anybody has any thoughts or questions, please raise your hand. I would love for this to be a dialogue. If not, I'll steamroll the whole thing. So raise your hand if you've got anything to say, or if you've done any study or read through this and have some thoughts that you feel like I'm leaving out or would be beneficial to share. Please feel free to share with everyone. For the genre of Don Quixote, it is pretty unique, in my opinion. I think it's a real pioneer of genre, and that's part of why it's so pivotal at this time in history and for what novels have become over the last few hundred years. It is one of the first fully formed satirical works in modern history. So if you are completely unfamiliar with Don Quixote, we'll get into an overview in just a second, but it is a satire of what history was already coming out of. At this time in around 1605, the turn of the century, history is moving away from medieval times and knights in shining armor on horseback saving damsels in distress and moving into the Renaissance. And those periods of history have been really well recorded and pretty well taught to our society today. And so we're very familiar with those concepts and those ideas. And I think that's part of why Don Quixote has held up so well for hundreds of years, because it is criticizing this old way of living, sort of. It is talking about knights in shining armor and is a satire of the people of 1605 who are holding on to those ideals of chivalry and heroism and trying to perpetuate that into this new age that they find themselves in. So the satire isn't necessarily about those things, but it's about continuing those things into what is a new era in human history. And Don Quixote is very episodic. If you are interested in picking up the book and you are intimidated at around 1,000 pages, I know I was when I first picked it up. Each chapter is about 3 to 5 pages on average, and a pretty well kept story, chapter by chapter. It makes for, I haven't done this with Doyle, I don't know if you'd really like it, but I imagine it would make for a really good nighttime bedtime story for a child. You pick up a book, you read a couple pages, it's silly, it's kind of funny. I think some of the parts of satire would be a little bit lost on some younger people, but the main character, Don Quixote, is ultimately very silly, and that is part of the satire. What differentiates it, in my opinion, from what we see as modern satire today is that typically a piece of satire, all of it is in on the joke, more or less. All of it supports the concept that the author is making a satire out of. So if you think 1984, if you think Animal Farm, a work of satire, every character in Animal Farm is part of what the author is making a satire about. That's a little bit different than Don Quixote, where Don Quixote is pretty crazy. He has his own ideals, his own visions, his own way of seeing the world, which quite literally he sees things differently than the people around him, but nobody else is in on the joke. Everybody else in Don Quixote is a pretty normal person. They serve as a foible or as the antagonist to Don Quixote every step of the way. And so his personality traits are satirical, but you get to see it in a world of more or less mundane, where everyone else is acting normally around it. It was published in full in 1605, part 1. And so sometimes when you hear about Don Quixote, you will only see people talking about part 1. It is more or less a standalone book. Usually when you see visual adaptations of Don Quixote, like a play or a movie, oftentimes it is just part 1, and they're saying that is the full story of Don Quixote. That's what it was in 1605. This was published some years before newspapers were widely distributed, and that's when writing turned into the serials, where they would publish chapters per week in newspapers. So this was before that time, so it was all published at once, despite it being very episodic. And then in 10 years, it took for part 2 to come out. Part 2 is another complete story, but it connects very smoothly, very seamlessly. We'll talk about part 2 very briefly tonight. For the time that we have together, I don't think we've got the breadth to get into a full summary of the entire thing. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Part 2 is really, really interesting. So the overview, for anyone who's completely unfamiliar with Don Quixote, it begins with a middle-aged man named Alonso Quijano, who is just a homebody. He's not described as doing anything for work. Maybe you'd think of him today as kind of a loser. He sits around his house, and all he does all day long is he reads books about chivalry. He reads these books about knights in shining armor, saving their damsels in distress. Sometimes these were more or less truthful stories. Usually they were complete works of fiction, and often they included fantastical elements. These are real books that were around at the time. And so Alonso Quijano is reading, these books in the work of fiction that are directly mirroring what a typical library would look like in Spain in 1605. And so it's all of these works of fiction, these tall tales, these fantasies, and these books drive him crazy. They make him lose his mind, more or less, because he is so consumed with what he sees as being so good about this knight in shining armor, especially chivalry, especially heroism. And so he decides he wants to become a hero. He wants to be a knight in shining armor. He renames himself Don Quixote. Don in Spanish means sir. It is not short for Donald. So he is Sir Quixote. And he starts to go on these quests, and that's what the individual chapters are. It's very episodic. Each quest, he wants to prove his worth as a knight and in some way restore chivalry into the world, restore a sense of heroism, restore a sense of goodness. And that all sounds like he's a good guy and sounds like he is a great main character. In reality, he is so far off base, it is hilarious. When you read through it, it reads as a comedy, because what he thinks is heroic in the moment is just so diluted from reality that the dissonance is what everyone around sees and comments on, but then also what you as a reader get to sit through and enjoy. We'll look through a lot of specific examples of that in just a moment. But the book alternates, and I think this is the most interesting part where there is a lot of depth, alternates between him and his diluted way of seeing the world, where you can see purpose and you can see goodness and drive and things that could be admirable, along with the reality that's just ridiculous, and then the commentary of everybody else involved in the situation. And you as the reader kind of get to decide where you fall. And every story you'll fall somewhere different, where you might side with Don Quixote at one point and think, he's weird right now, but I stand by it. I might do it too. Maybe he's trying to do something good. Other times you think he's absolutely in the wrong, and you completely agree with all of the characters around who are fighting back or making fun of him. And where you stand on it is different for each person. It has some major themes. Realism versus idealism is probably the biggest one. And this is where there's some depth and nuance into Don Quixote. If you were to look at any review, some of them will say he is a good guy, that he is pushing for some goodness. And others will say he is actually the villain of his own story, that he is an agent of chaos all throughout it, and not something to be admired. The reality is probably a little bit in the middle. If you read it just on its surface level, probably he's just a silly guy. But some of the debate along the way and over the last couple hundred years, if people have unpacked this, some of the debate is, did he really have a leg to stand on at some of these points? Fighting for heroism, fighting for goodness and chivalry. Was there goodness? Is there something admirable behind Don Quixote? Or is the reality of the situation and the realism meant to be the main takeaway? I think it is a little bit ambiguous throughout the book, and that's part of why it's fun to read, that people will have different opinions. Sanity is a big one. He looks crazy. It's stated a few times, I think, outright that he's crazy. But how crazy is he? I was looking at, in preparation for this, looking at someone making the case that he was completely aware of how diluted his actions were the whole time, that he was intentionally going about it to either buck trends or buck the norm, or make a point and make a case. I think that's kind of a difficult point to make. But the idea of how crazy is he is a bit up for debate, and the idea of how crazy are any of us is part of the takeaway from the book. What looks totally normal to one person looks completely insane to someone else, and that's one of the themes throughout it. It is in many ways a love story. We'll get into the specific examples of love from part 1 to give you a good impression of how it conveys love. But love is a central theme. It is a driving force for Don Quixote. And then along the way, he sees many different love stories from different angles and different vantage points. I think one is a love triangle. One is a love point. There's only one person. One's a love square where there are 4 people. And it's just a neat commentary about how relationships work and the depth and complexity of realistic relationships being compared to the simplicity of a chivalrous relationship. Well, the damsel in distress, you are faithful to the one person and they're faithful to you. And you see those put in juxtaposition with one another. And that's one of the major themes. And then heroism, again, being a major theme throughout it, and kind of the question of, is heroism a good thing? If you make yourself the hero in the moment, is that good, or are you a bull in a china shop, just causing destruction as you're trying to be the main character in your own life? It has a lot of major archetypes that it, I think, pioneers, that end up becoming a major part in many works of literature. Unreliable narration. I think this is one of the very first examples of an unreliable narrator. It is a third person perspective, but it does put you in the position of Don Quixote. You see what he's thinking, and when he is speaking, the narrator is kind of along for the ride in his head. And so one of the first examples of an unreliable narrator, we see that in a lot of literature now, and a lot of that is built off the legwork that Miguel de Cervantes had with Don Quixote. was struggling to find the right phrase for this. Buddy comedy isn't the best one, but it's one of the first novels, one of the first examples in modern literature that we have where the story follows two people instead of just a single main character. Especially if you look at the novels that he was making a satire of, it's usually one knight in shining armor. You are following King Arthur, you are following Lancelot, you are following one person in whatever they're doing. And this really has two main characters throughout the whole story, is Don Quixote and his squire, sort of squire, it's his neighbor, named Sancho. And it feels kind of like a buddy comedy. Sancho is the straight man to Don Quixote's craziness. He is very grounded in reality. He's still pretty silly from time to time throughout the book. But it's this, using a duo to tell a story and putting almost an insert in to get more depth from your main character. We see that, not to spoil anything, but for Lord of the Rings, Sam and Frodo go through a huge part of their journey together, and you learn so much more about Frodo because Sam is there. It's a great device to be used by an author to get more depth and complexity from your main character. And we see this in Don Quixote. And then distinction between class and worth. I don't know exactly how original this is to Don Quixote, but it's a major theme. And again, in comparison to the books about chivalry and knights in shining armor, usually the person who was good and morally good was the one who had status, was the one who had wealth. And it was almost seen as a sense of karma. So like naturally, they're going to have this status and this wealth if they stand for goodness. And what we see time and again in Don Quixote is that the people with wealth and the people with status are generally kind of slimy. And it's his peasant squire Sancho who ends up being the voice of reason to Don Quixote throughout most of both of the books. And so kind of this divide between what your status is and then what your intrinsic worth is, whether it's the worth of your thoughts or the worth of yourself as a person. We'll go through an introductory summary. Most of this is going to be just in the first 50 pages. So if you're wondering if you should read this or not, we're not going to spoil a ton. We are going to talk about the highlights of the end of part 1 and then a general summary of part 2 as well. But just for the fun of going through the episodes, wanted to kind of catch anybody up who hasn't read through it of what this really looks like as it plays out in the first several pages. Don Quixote, again, his name was Alonso. He decides to rename himself Don Quixote. He begins, as he embarks on becoming a knight, by taking this old suit of armor that he just has lying around in his house. It's not been used. It's not exactly tailor-fitted to him. It's not set up on a display. He just takes this disheveled armor, puts it on, calls himself a knight. He spends a few days thinking about what to name his horse. He's got this old, lean, raggedy horse, and he names it Rocinante. Rocinante would be like a very valiant, like war horse name to give to this kind of decrepit, lean horse that he's got. And so I was thinking of different examples of what that would look like today. I think if you had a pack mule and you decided to name it Secretariat and you took it out onto the racetrack, that would be what Don Quixote is doing. And to him, it makes complete sense. And he sets out to find quests. He has no idea where he's going, no idea what he's doing, but he is, it doesn't matter because he's decided he's a knight and he's going to make it happen. And in his mind, destiny makes these things happen, more or less. He finds a random farm girl and decides that she is his damsel in distress. Her name is Dulcinea de Toboso, and they never talk. She is, I mean, the biggest part of this book, besides Don Quixote. She is the driving force to so much of the plot. He references her all the time, talks about her all the time. She is the whole reason why he's doing everything he's doing, because a knight has to have a damsel in distress. And the goofy part is he's never talked to this girl. The reader actually never even meets Dulcinea. There are a couple times where it seems like she might appear in the plot, and then something happens where she doesn't. She is not present in the book at all, and yet it's this main driving force for Don Quixote. So he leaves his house. He picks this damsel in, not even in distress, just the damsel, and decides, everything that I have is for Dulcinea. He immediately goes to an inn that's nearby, and he believes or decides, that's kind of where the reality is up to debate. If he's truly crazy, he sees it and sees a castle. If you think he's a little bit more sane, then it maybe appears on the surface, then he's deciding. But he finds an inn, and in his mind, it is a castle. He talks to everyone as though they are noble people. And so some ladies of the night he is talking to as they are noble ladies. And it's just a real fun tongue-in-cheek as you read through it of how they're responding to it. Is real goofy. He puts his armor in the, I believe it's in the stables overnight, and he sits next to it to guard it. He doesn't want anyone to touch his armor, and anyone who comes close, and there's a lot more to do in the stables than steal his armor. People are walking by on normal business. Anyone who gets within a certain distance of his armor, he immediately picks a fight with, starts beating them up, and it's going pretty well. Most fights don't work out for Don Quixote. This one, he's actually on the winning end, I guess, because they're not warriors. They're just people staying at an inn for the night. And so the innkeeper sees this disturbance. He goes over and he dubs Don Quixote an official knight, the innkeeper being the lord of the castle, just to get Don Quixote to leave and quit beating up his patrons. Right after this, this is one of my favorite stories. This feels like a parable, one that we almost sort of talked about this past Sunday. But when he leaves the inn, he walks past a slave named Andres. Andres shows up later on in part 1, not in a too significant way, but he has a recurring thread. Andres is tied to a tree. He's a slave, and he's being beaten by his master. Don Quixote takes offense by this, and he is talking to the master, and with very strong words, he asks the master to stop beating Andres, makes him promise not to, makes him promise to treat him fairly, makes him promise to give him higher wages, and they have a good talk. Don Quixote walks away, and his head is held high, thinking, I've just saved this poor man. And I mean, it's a book, but you can just see him trotting away as the slave starts screaming again in the distance, because after the conversation, the master goes right back to beating the slave. And this shows the naivety of Don Quixote in many ways. Some of it's complete delusion, some of it's just this naivety where he thinks coming through, having a single conversation, that's what a knight does. It saves the day. I've made this person's life better. Boom, I can move on. When in reality, he changed absolutely nothing. The slave is, I think, getting beaten worse after the conversation. Has to be hospitalized for quite some time when we see Andres show back up. But he thinks this is a major success. In the same chapter, right after, he's walking around and finds some merchants from Toledo, which is a place in Spain, not in Ohio, and finds these merchants, and he starts the conversation. They aren't bothering him. He immediately demands that they confess that Dulcinea is the most beautiful lady in all of the land. And the merchants, I think, have a pretty reasonable response to this. They say, well, can we see her? And one of them even says, I wouldn't feel comfortable making that confession about a woman I've never laid eyes on. And this obviously is a huge offense to Don Quixote. He thinks that you need to see Dulcinea to think she's beautiful is just an offense against her honor. And so he starts to fight them. But like we'll see for pretty much the rest of both books, it doesn't go very well. There are a couple of fights that Don Quixote wins, usually against just normal people who don't fight at all. But most of the time when Don Quixote gets in a fight, he gets some pretty bad injuries. And this one is one of those. He starts to fight them. They beat the tar out of him very easily and very quickly. They break his lance. His lance breaks many times throughout the books. And I think it's a symbol of his knighthood being so fragile in the time that they find themselves in. But they beat him up. He almost dies. He's saved by a neighbor nearby, and they bring him back to heal from these pretty significant wounds. While he's recovering from these wounds, some of the townspeople still care about Don Quixote on kind of a friendly level. There's a priest and a barber in particular that we'll see as a recurring pair of friends that are trying to keep some sanity in Don Quixote's life or return him from the lunacy that he's found himself in. And so while he is healing, they take what they think is the problem, which is all of the books that he read, all of the influence that led him to become a knight errant. And so they take all of these books, I think the priest picks a couple that are valuable. He sets those off to the side. They burn the rest of them. And then they seal up his room so that he can't get back into the room where he kept all of his books. And then when he wakes up, they tell him a wizard sealed the door and you can't get in. And he buys it immediately. It makes complete sense to Don Quixote. He doesn't question it. And that's the end of the books. But it doesn't bring him back to any kind of sanity. And so this is kind of the end of the introduction, I guess. After this happens, he finds a neighbor named Sancho. And this is, again, maybe we're 40, 50 pages, something into the book by now. And Sancho is the second major character for the rest of both books. He promises Sancho that he can be a governor of something. Don Quixote is under the impression that if you're a knight, people will offer you governance on a weekly basis. And so he promises Sancho he'll be a governor of something if he pledges loyalty to Don Quixote and becomes the squire. And so that's what he does. Sancho becomes a squire. There are some ways in which he's described as not being super intelligent. He's a peasant. He's not, well articulated. He's not super eloquent, but he is kind of the wisdom of the people. The real salt of the earth. Yeah, real salt of the earth kind of guy. His wisdom comes from common sense. And so he ends up being the straight man. He runs a lot of errands for Don Quixote throughout their many episodes. Usually when he's about to get into trouble, Sancho is telling him why not to. And then he does anyway. And then Sancho tries to clean up the mess. Usually they get in some legal issues because whatever trouble Don Quixote is getting in is a crime, like fighting people. And then Sancho says, maybe we should hide in this place, or maybe we should go to this place so that the authorities won't arrest us immediately. It doesn't work very well. So a couple more stories to kind of summarize part one. I'd be remiss if we didn't mention the giants. I think this is probably the most iconic single scene in Don Quixote. Definitely the one that stuck in my mind the most when I read it in high school. Don Quixote is traveling and he sees giants. And so he decides to fight the giants because that's what knights do. On his horse, Rocinante, Don Quixote sees these giants. He's getting his lance ready, preparing for the charge. And Sancho tells him, sir, these are not giants. Those are windmills. And in the distance, there are windmills spinning. And Don Quixote is completely unperturbed. So he goes forward to attack the windmills. And he gets minor injuries and he loses the fight. There's an old black and white picture of Don Quixote where I think this scene is really well done. And you can see just the slow turning windmills. They're on wood and cloth panels that are just slowly going. And he tries to stab at them every time one swings down. And it just bumps him over and over again until he sustains enough injuries to be done fighting with the windmills. So I won't summarize every single part of part one. I do want to summarize a few of the love stories because I think it's interesting. It's hard to find a direct link. We'll have a moment in a while where we'll talk about some of the inspired works throughout history from Don Quixote. It's a little bit difficult to find direct links. Some are outright stated by the creators that, my inspiration was Don Quixote, but I think it was written so long ago and was such a pivotal piece in literature that it has inspired many, many different things. I'd like to think it inspired a lot of telenovelas. If anyone's unfamiliar, that's in a lot of Latin American and Spanish communities, basically soap operas. These long, drawn-out love stories, very complicated. Someone's in love with someone who's in love with someone else who had an affair with someone else. Ultimately, someone's mother's involved. It's highly dramatic, and it takes usually 100 and something episodes to wrap up. I'd like to think in a lot of ways, Don Quixote is the precursor to that, especially in these love stories. As you'll see, some of them are straightforward, like Dulcinea de Toboso, and others are very, very complicated. I'll do my best to put them in a nutshell, but I want to go over a few of these just to talk about love as a theme throughout Don Quixote. Obviously, we talked about his love interest being Dulcinea. He never meets her, but she is this main motivator for everything that he does. Several times he thinks his faithfulness is tested. I don't think anyone ever tries to come on to Don Quixote throughout the books, but there are a few times where a woman's nearby and he decides, I need to be faithful to Dulcinea and protect my honor and her dignity, and so I'll have nothing to do with this girl who already wants nothing to do with him. So several times it's tested, and he remains loyal. I think this is obviously a satire of this type of love, but it does show some of the good things about faithfulness, some of the good things about a chivalrous kind of love and relationship. There are some positives there. There's a huge mirror to this, at least in my opinion. This mirrors pretty well with a story of a girl named Marcella who shows up. Now, in my mind, if Dulcinea were in the book, she would talk a lot like Marcella. Don Quixote and Sancho stumble upon a funeral in one of their many episodes for a young man who had this spurned love for a shepherdess named Marcella. And part of the funeral is they're reading out these notes that the young man had written, saying how upset he was with Marcella for not loving him back, for leading him on, for, he was in this chivalrous, loving relationship towards her, and she was not reciprocating to him. And it makes her look like the bad guy. And in most of the kind of now ancient European works that predate Don Quixote, the lady would have been the bad guy for something like that. If you think of a knight in shining armor saving a damsel in distress, and then the damsel says, no, thank you, you don't read about that happening. And so this is the funeral of this guy. Don Quixote and Sancho are kind of just there, and Marcella crashes the funeral, comes in and talks to the whole crowd about, I never led this person on. I never did anything wrong to him. I just didn't like him. I didn't really have anything to do with him. He decided he loved me, and he died for it. And, maybe that's sad, but how is this my fault? At the time, a pretty progressive take on romance. I know that sounds a little funny to say today, but it was. It was progressive for the time, and it shows, I think, on one part, the individuality of the woman in the relationship, and that's an obviously significant factor to any relationship. But also it's, I think, putting in juxtaposition the relationship that Don Quixote has with Dulcinea, that he's effectively doing the exact same thing. We don't see him on his deathbed at this point in the book, and it's not because of a lost love for Dulcinea when he does end up dying. But it is this irony of having a very one-sided love affair. This is the most complicated. So if you love soap operas, buckle up, because this is a good time. If I lose you when I hit next slide, it'll be easy to catch up. Don Quixote and Sancho are very much uninvolved from this, and this whole story plays out over several different chapters in several different points of view. But putting it in a summary, there are two people, Cardenio and Lucinda. The crew meets Cardenio, and he is like a haggard kind of mountain man. He's on the lam, more or less. But he was childhood sweethearts with a lady called Lucinda, and they wanted to be married to each other. Lucinda instead gets swept away by a guy named Don Fernando, who's just the worst. He is the typical, I don't know, like Steal Your Girl was a meme with the teenagers not too long ago. And it was the type of person who could come into a relationship and steal your girlfriend away. Don Fernando was one of the originals at this, and that's exactly what he did. He convinces Lucinda's parents that he's worth marrying because of his status, because of his wealth, as opposed to Cardenio. Unbeknownst to Cardenio, Lucinda doesn't have much of a choice. Her parents want her to marry Don Fernando, so that's what she goes along with. Cardenio thinks that Lucinda is doing this of her own accord, so his heart is broken, and he leaves to become a mountain man. That's where we meet him originally. Fernando's not a great guy, and Lucinda doesn't really love him, and so she's stalling this marriage as long as she can. While he's away in anger, and I think our crew is here to actually see this meeting, Cardenio meets a lady named Dorothea, and Dorothea reveals that she also has a history with Don Fernando. And so what we see is this love triangle is now a love rectangle. And Don Fernando basically wanted to sleep with Dorothea. So he promised her, I will marry you, took her to bed, and then he left. It's a little graphic, but that's what happens in the book. So Don Fernando's a bad guy, but they are in a tavern together, Cardenio and Dorothea, with Don Quixote and Sancho. They're kind of all talking about this when in walks a couple wearing masks, and it is revealed that this couple that walks in is Don Fernando and Lucinda. What are the odds? And so here they all are in one tavern, and they manage to convince Don Fernando to abandon his engagement with Lucinda, do right by Dorothea and marry her, and then Cardenio and Lucinda end up getting married, and so they find their original partners, and everyone's happy. I like the note that Don Quixote and Sancho are barely involved. They are really just onlookers to this whole saga that has unveiled over several chapters. They're very much involved in some things. Yeah.
Some of his self-deprecation, he criticizes some of those chivalry books of highly improbable things happening, and this is highly improbable. So he's really criticizing himself on purpose.
Yeah.
And some of the improbabilities.
Yeah. And so this is an interesting conversation. I think we'll get into it now for the fun of it. There's a scene, probably one of the best quotes in the whole book, is around this time where Don Quixote is talking about the chivalry books that he previously read a ton of, and he's talking about how silly they are. And obviously, there's a lot of friction there because he used to love them. I think it's a pretty meta take on the whole thing, because it's also Miguel de Cervantes saying it's silly when books have these huge coincidences just happen for the plot to happen and for things to come true. And then he writes one into his own book. To get a little bit ahead of ourselves, Miguel de Cervantes was very much ahead of his time with that kind of self-awareness. Part 1 and part 2 were written 10 years apart. They flow together very well, but the biggest thing that happens in between is that in the lore of Don Quixote, it is an actual 10-year gap during which Miguel de Cervantes has published Don Quixote Part 1. And so at the beginning of Part 2, Don Quixote and Sancho are very famous, and they know it. It's very strange. So Miguel de Cervantes really is, he is self-aware as he's writing through all of it and trying to stay on top of what he's doing as a meta on top of the book itself. Can be a little bit of a journey, but here's probably the best example of it on a smaller scale. The last example of love, just as one of my favorite components to it, is a boy named Eugenio. He is a goat herd, and the crew sees him yelling pretty angrily at his goat. He later explains it's because he's upset that the love of his life has left him, his love being Leandra, and so he's taking it out on his goat. Leandra was the wealthiest girl in his town, and he was a suitor for Leandra. She presumably liked him back, but ultimately chose a man named Vicente over him. Vicente just took her for her money, got her for everything that she was worth, and then she went away in shame without a penny to her name, I believe, to a convent. My favorite part about this, there's no real resolution to these two, I think, but Eugenio left to go be a goat herder, and he discovered in the mountains that it is full. They are crowded with all of Leandra's suitors. And I just think, what a goofy thing to find yourself in. Like, every person in the mountain, it's described as just being crowded with all of the same people in the exact same position he's in. And I think in many ways, it's a commentary on love and relationships, that you often think your heartache is unique, that you are special, that you are different, or, in worst cases, that you are alone and no one can relate to you. And this is a really humorous way to say, it hurt his heart so badly, he left everything he knew to be a goat herder, along with everyone else. And so, again, the whole book is very comical as you're reading through it. A lot of these details are just really funny to me. But the way that it talks about love, we'll get into in a few minutes with a discussion question about it. It's just really interesting, I think, that it balances some things that are extreme and silly, that are hyperbolic of relationships at the time, but is really trying to fight back against this concept of the hopeless romantic and these huge ideals as they play out in relationships. And it doesn't really promote a very normal, healthy relationship, I think, throughout the book. But it makes fun of all of the unhealthy ones in a way that you can kind of see the structure that it's putting forward as how normal people would be in a relationship. The way that part 1 ends, you can plug your ears if you don't want to have a spoiler, but it's not a huge spoiler. They're threatened with legal trouble because of the various crimes that Don Quixote has committed. Probably the biggest one was freeing a whole host of galley slaves, who I believe rob him for what he has and beat him up on their way out. But you can't do that. So he's facing some legal issues, and the priest and the barber from before, they convince authorities to spare Don Quixote because he's crazy. basically pleading insanity at the court case. They don't make it as far as a court case. And so what they do is they're going to take him back home. They're pretty far away from where they started. And to convince Don Quixote to go back home, they put him in a cage. They tell him he's enchanted. He believes it immediately. Several things happen on the way back while he's in the cage. And so it's kind of funny for those episodes to be like cage Don Quixote. I actually think the whole time he talks to Eugenio, he's in a cage. And part of his wisdom to Eugenio is like, if I weren't in a cage right now, I would chase her down and I'd finally end her. And that's what you ought to do. But he's in a cage. They eventually bring him back home. And that's kind of the end of part one. Very, very briefly, because we're almost out of time already. Very briefly, part two is fascinating. It is well worth the read. It starts with a preface. In the 10 years in between, there was a different author who published Don Quixote Part 2. Copyright didn't exist very effectively at the time that these books were written. We see this also with Sherlock Holmes, that there was a lot of different Sherlock Holmes authors and stories that would sometimes put the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's name down, even if it was a different writer. So it's pseudepigraphal. But someone else wrote and published Don Quixote Part 2. It's not very good. I've not read it, the fake version. I've read some excerpts and about it. But it hurt Miguel de Cervantes' feelings. And so there's a preface in it. Actually, I'll read a part to it because it's so fun, if I can find it quickly. He writes a preface that's basically saying, I bet you all expect me to talk about the other book. And I'm not going to do that, basically because it's terrible and it speaks for itself. But the preface is kind of clarifying, that this is the official part 2, that it's not the fake part 2. Yeah, his preface to the reader. He says, you must be now waiting for this preface, expecting to find in it resentments, railings, and invectives against the author of the second Don Quixote. But in truth, it's not my design to give you that satisfaction. For though the injuries are apt to awaken choler in the humblest breasts, yet in mine this rule must admit an exception. You would have me perhaps call him. And then he says several words to call the author. And he basically says, you might want me to call him these names, like this one, like this one, like this one, like this one, but I will not. And it is so funny. Part 2 is remarkably consistent for there being 10 years in between and like a lot of meta development. Don Quixote hasn't changed much. He has the same drive, the same initiatives, and the context, the setting of it is a little bit different. Predominantly, there's a duke and a duchess that he lives with. They're amused by his craziness. They take him in and they just kind of play him like a puppet. They set him on all these sorts of quests and they know it's all fake and all silly, but they just kind of like to see the chaos and see what happens. But ultimately, the way that it ends, he battles the Knight of the White Moon, which ends up being one of his old friends in disguise. And it's a duel on a wager that if he loses the duel, he will renounce being a knight errant for 1 year. He loses the duel miserably because Don Quixote is not a good knight. He has no training and is not qualified for this. So he goes back home and in sadness, and he basically dies of heartbreak. It's a pretty definitive reason why he died at the end was so that other authors couldn't come along and write more about Don Quixote. That's the same reason why we see Sir Arthur Conan Doyle eventually kill Sherlock Holmes. That it was because of that widespread pseudepigrapha that they wanted to make sure that in canon, people know when the story's over. And that's kind of how it ends. As far as impact, there are a lot of works inspired by Don Quixote. Namely, The Idiot by Dostoevsky is said by the author to be a direct inspiration of the character Don Quixote. Shakespeare wrote a play called Cardenio. It's one of the lost plays, but one of the love stories that we were talking about was Cardenio. And so Shakespeare read it and liked it enough to make a play around it. I think there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different works that we could put as likely taking major inspiration from Don Quixote. A few that I would put are Sherlock Holmes, the idea of a duo moving together where one is eccentric and the other is kind of the straight man. Obviously plays out very differently. Sherlock Holmes is very qualified and capable, but I think takes some inspiration. Cyrano de Bergerac, if anyone is familiar with that one, I think also takes some inspiration. Cyrano de Bergerac was written a couple hundred years after this as mainly a satire to Romeo and Juliet, It's set in France, and we see some of the identical scenes of Romeo and Juliet played out through huge satire. But it's similar to Don Quixote, where the main character is just lost in romance and doesn't see reason and doesn't see reality. I think Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, that type of real episodic literary, using that as a literary device, I think pulls from Don Quixote. It plays a lot in how works were published for a long time afterwards in serials through newspapers. So they kind of lended themselves to episodes anyway. But I think you could look back to Don Quixote and see that. But I have a couple discussion questions before we're done. If anyone has thoughts about this, I always want to talk about how a Christian worldview comes into contact with some of these great books that we have around us. And so really, I think the big one for me was how to balance the concept of idealism or heroism with reality. That's the main question of Don Quixote. And in large part, it's in favor of reality. On his deathbed, Don Quixote kind of, what's the word for it? Not forgoes, but he kind of disavows everything that he stood for. On his deathbed, he says, like, this was all for naught. Maybe we shouldn't be taking these ideals of chivalry into this generation. Maybe we shouldn't be trying to resurrect the past. We should just be moving forward in our new generation. And so, the commentary of the book is really in favor of reality, almost anti-idealism and anti-heroism. When I think in the Christian worldview, there's a little bit more debate around that the idea that we should have very strong ideals, even when they don't look realistic as they're applied to our culture and our situation. Usually that's a good thing and one that we should push for. The idea of acting very countercultural to the point of looking crazy is something that we see often throughout the book of Acts, and maybe one that we would want to model ourselves after. I think a lot of the depth of Don Quixote plays with the sanity conversation of how sane is he really, what is reality versus his perception. And it's almost a precursor to postmodernism that so highly elevates perception and perspective. Postmodern culture did that for many, many years, where they almost said there is no truth. Really, many people were making that claim for a long time. But saying instead of truth, there is just perspective and perception. And in Don Quixote, we see that, yeah, he has his perception, he has his perspective that is very definitive, but it's also very wrong. But there is something to be said about the value of someone's perception, the value of perspective. But really, as a Christian, how do we balance giving weight to perception and perspective, along with the idea that it's not just these philosophies of perception versus reality. It is this conversation with the framework that there is eternal truth in this world, and it has been revealed through Scripture. And so there is a definite reality in the spiritual sense that we can hold to. So how does that balance with individual perspective? And then just some thoughts on love. But I don't know if we had any questions or any thoughts to this. Yeah, please.
I did read it, and I thought it was the love thing. It was not so. At the end of the second part, when they go home, Don Quixote and Sancho, they go back. Well, Sancho's been married this whole time, and he is faithful to his wife as well. But it is when they separate in the town to go to their various homes, his wife and daughter are there to meet him, and it just makes this comment where the daughter's on one side, and he takes his wife's hand, and they walk home, and I was like, that's the reality. The family, the daughter, and his mule, and his wife, and he grabs her hand, and there's no fanfare or made of it. It's just a little subtle comment. Yes, there is. When you're talking about all these other weird love stories. That's the reality. Yeah.
I think the weird part of that is how quick he was to leave his family for such a long period of time. Yeah. Yeah, Jordan.
I think what's funny to me is just, if you think of like every single Batman movie that's come out in the past, like honestly 20-some years, it's like playing the character completely straight and acting like there's nothing bizarre about someone's recreationally beating up criminals. And it's really interesting looking how different that is from Don Quixote when they're kind of doing the same thing.
Mhm.
And it's just, I think the C.S. Lewis quote was talking about witchcraft. The question is not about, doctrine or faith. The question is about objective reality. And so if there actually are witches, then the correct thing to do is to freak out and have witch trials and do all this stuff. And so it's funny that in this reality, the response to Don Quixote is just all things is not good. If he happened to be able to identify criminals and beat them up successfully, repeatedly, like this would be such a different story.
Mhm.
And people's reaction is always so different. And I think that's true in every celebrity, you know, like if they weren't good at their one thing, would you tolerate all their other eccentricities and anything else? But but they are. So interesting.
Mhm.
I found the prologue to part one totally hilarious, and I was laughing throughout at many points in the book. But he's self-referencing, you know, his problem. And I just wanted to read a couple sections. I'm skipping over parts, so you don't have to listen to it all, but the whole thing is funny. And so in the prologue, he's saying, "All I wanted to offer you plain and simple, without the embellishment of a prologue or countless sonnets, epigrams, eulogies. The hardest part was writing this prologue you're reading. Time after time, I took up the pen to write and put it down and not knowing what I was gonna say. But then, so he's uninspired, but he tells his friend about it, and his friend says, heard this, he slapped his forehead and gave a hearty laugh and said, 'My brother, I realize how mistaken I've been about you all this time we've known each other, because I always considered you to be enlightened and judicious in everything you did. But now I see that you're far from being so as heaven is from earth. How is it possible that the things of so little consequence and so easy to remedy can baffle and absorb such a mind as yours, which is able to break through?' And so he gives him all this advice on how to write the prologue, which is in the prologue. And finally says, you just need to have lots of recommendations and people who say your book's great. And then, so he then includes all these recommendations for the book and how wonderful it is. But they're from fantastic people that never existed, from people that died long before he existed.
Yeah.
And so they're all a bunch of lies.
From the horse.
And one from the horse itself.
Yeah.
That's
hilarious.
So the whole thing.
Yeah.
The way he writes is super hilarious.
Well, and I think what's just so fun about it is you could say that it was written in the year 2000 and it would make a lot of sense. A lot of the jokes just about culture and about even Hollywood and media. I mean, they were true 400 years ago and are still true today. But the way that he thinks about it, I think shares so many similarities because it's shaped how people think based off of the work entirely. But it's just so funny. You know, a lot of times we get into some older works and we lose their sense of humor entirely because it's a different time and a different culture. And his really are just as funny as if they were modern.
Oh, there are many good translations, but this one has lots of footnotes if you want to know what these obscure references are.
Yeah, I didn't actually love my translation. So if anyone wants to know which English translation to use, ask Bill.
Well, I mean, I lucked into it at Half Price Books, but we compared, and Lynn's translation is pretty good too, but not very many footnotes.
So what is your translation?
It's by a guy named Tom Lathrop, who's was the president of the Cervantes Society of America.
Oh, sounds qualified. That'll do it for our time. If you have any more thoughts or questions, feel free to come up and talk with me.